On the evening of the 2nd of November, 1988, a small program began to spread across the network that would become the modern internet. It connected over 60,000 computers at universities and research companies, and the people who ran them trusted one another. The network was built on that trust. By the next morning, thousands of those computers had slowed or stopped entirely. Not because a file had been deleted, not because data had been stolen, but because each machine was filling with copies of the same program until it choked. Inside it was a piece of code whose only job was to prevent exactly this, a safeguard. And the safeguard is what made it worse. The person who wrote it was a first-year graduate student. The clearest account came not from the press, but from a commission of his own university and a federal appeals court reading the same evidence. This is the story of the safeguard that backfired. The truth leaves a paper trail. Let's follow it. Findings of fact. The incident is the Morris worm, the first self-spreading program to sweep the early internet, released on the 2nd of November, 1988, from a computer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It matters because it forced a trusting research network to confront its own fragility, and it created the template for how the world responds to security emergencies. We will trace how one small design decision, meant to keep the program rare, instead drove it into runaway growth, a network built on trust. To understand the worm, you first have to understand the network it moved through, because that network was nothing like the internet of today. It had grown out of a project funded by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the agency usually shortened to DARPA. Beginning in the late 1960s, DARPA had backed a new way of moving information between computers, breaking messages into small packets and routing them across shared lines. By 1988, that idea had grown into a collection of connected networks that the General Accounting Office described as linking more than 60,000 computers across the country and overseas. The people on it were researchers. They exchanged mail, shared code, and logged into one another's machines to fix problems remotely. The Cornell Commission that later investigated the worm put it plainly. There was, they wrote, a reasonable trust between scholars in the pursuit of knowledge, a trust upon which the users of the network had relied for many years. That trust was designed into the software. Most of the affected machines ran a version of the Unix operating system, developed at the University of California, Berkeley, and distributed at little more than the cost of the tape. It was powerful, it was shared freely, and it was never built to keep out a determined intruder. One of Unix's own creators had written, in a note distributed with the manual, that the system was not developed with security in mind, and that this fact alone guaranteed a vast number of holes. There is one more thing worth understanding about this world, because it shaped everything that followed. The software on these machines was maintained collaboratively. When someone at Berkeley found a flaw, they might quietly fix it and send the repair out with the next release. When someone at one university found a hole, the practice of sharing informal code and debugging remotely across the network meant a fix could travel from campus to campus overnight. Much had been built this way that could not have been built under stricter conditions. The Cornell Commission was explicit that this informal, trusting style of development had yielded real benefits, and that the community would lose something important if it responded to the worm by walling itself off. So the picture, in the autumn of 1988, is a fast-growing network of open doors run by people who left them open on purpose. Because openness was the point, and because openness had worked. That is the world the worm was released into, and it is why the worm landed the way it did, the student and the program. In the fall of 1988, Robert Tappan Morris was a first-year graduate student in computer science at Cornell University. He had arrived with real experience, from undergraduate work at Harvard and from jobs in computing. and among his fellow students he talked about the security of computer networks and his ability to get through it. The Cornell Commission was careful about how it described his ability, and this matters because the popular story tends to reach for the word genius. The Commission did not. Although the worm was technically sophisticated, they wrote, its creation required dedication and perseverance rather than technical brilliance. It could have been written, they said, by many students at Cornell or elsewhere, given knowledge of the security flaws it used. What the program did was simple to state and hard to do well. It was designed to spread on its own from one computer to the next across the network without a human guiding each step. In the language that quickly attached to it, it was a worm, a program that copies itself across machines as opposed to a virus which rides along inside another program. The press called it a virus. Technically, the investigators agreed it was a worm. Morris wanted it to spread quietly. He designed it to take up little processing time so it would not interfere with normal use, and he wrote it to be hard to detect and hard to read so that other programmers could not easily kill it. He even built in a piece of misdirection, code that made the worm appear to be sending information to a computer at Berkeley to point suspicion somewhere else. According to the appeals court that later reviewed the case, the stated goal was to demonstrate the inadequacies of the security measures then in use. You will often hear a gentler version that he only wanted to measure the size of the internet. Treat that as a later characterization. The most cautious voice in the record, the Cornell Commission, concluded that his true intentions may never be fully known. We do have one unusually direct window into his thinking though. On his own computer, investigators later recovered an early version of the program, dated the middle of October, that he had left unencrypted, apparently by accident. In the margins of that early code were his own design notes. They talk about methods of breaking into other systems. They talk about stealing the password file. They talk about a way for him to send out commands to the worm, protected by a password. These were not the notes of someone who had stumbled into trouble. They were the working notes of a project built deliberately, over about 2 weeks, with sustained effort. The Commission found that the launch itself may have been impulsive, but the building of the thing was not. 4 ways through the door. For the worm to spread, it needed ways to get from a machine it had already taken over onto a machine it had not. The court record lists 4, and it is worth walking through them slowly, because each one exploited the same underlying condition, a network that assumed good faith. The first way used a program called the finger daemon. On these systems, you could ask a remote machine for a little public information about its users, and a small background program would answer. That program made one careless mistake. It read the incoming request into a fixed space in memory, without ever checking how long the request was. The worm sent a request that was far too long. In the technical analysis by Eugene Spafford of Purdue, a string of 536 bytes, and the excess spilled past the space set aside for it, and overwrote the machine's own instructions for what to do next. By choosing exactly what spilled over, the worm redirected the computer into running the attacker's commands. Today we call that a buffer overflow. In 1988, it was one of the worm's sharpest tools. The second way used the mail program called sendmail. Sendmail had a debugging feature meant to help administrators test that mail was arriving. That feature let a message be addressed not to a person, but to a command, which the receiving machine would then carry out. In the Berkeley distribution, this debugging feature was left switched on by default. The worm used it to hand a receiving computer a short program and have it run. The third way was simple guessing. The worm carried a built-in list of likely passwords, 432 words in Spafford's count, and it also tried each user's own name and the machine's ordinary dictionary of words. People choose passwords they can remember. Enough of them chose badly. The fourth way used trust directly. Unix let a user set up trusted relationships between accounts on different machines, so that once you were logged in on one, you could move to another without a password. This was a convenience, not really a flaw. If two machines had agreed to trust each other, a user on the first could reach the second freely. The worm looked for those relationships and walked straight through them, no password required. It is worth pausing on the second method for a moment, the mail one, because it drew an unusual defense from the very person who wrote the mail program. The debugging feature the worm abused had been left in on purpose. Its designer argued that being able to test a mail system on a distant machine without needing special privileges there was genuinely important for maintaining programs across a network. The feature could be switched off. In the most common distribution, it was left switched on. The lesson was not that one careless programmer erred. It was that a convenience, sensible in isolation, becomes a doorway the moment it ships enabled by default to 60,000 machines. 4 doors then. But breaking in was never the dangerous part. The Cornell Commission put it bluntly, saying that to exploit weaknesses like these was no act of genius or heroism. What made this incident is what the worm did once it was inside, the safeguard. Morris understood a danger in his own design. If the worm kept landing on the same machine and copying itself again and again, the copies would pile up. A machine running many copies of the worm would slow down and eventually crash, and a crashing machine would draw attention. Piling up was the one thing he most needed to avoid, so he built a safeguard. When the worm arrived on a computer, it would ask that computer a question: "Do you already have a copy of me?" If the answer was no, the worm would install itself. If the answer was yes, one of the 2 copies would agree to shut down so that only one would remain. The appeals court described the mechanism in exactly those terms. The worm asked each computer whether it already had a copy. If the answer was no, it copied itself. If yes, it would not duplicate. On its face, this is sound engineering. It is population control. Keep at most 1 worm per machine, and no machine can be buried. But Morris then worried about a defense. What if the people running these computers figured out the trick? What if they simply programmed their own machines to always answer yes, whether or not a worm was actually present? Then the worm could never get a foothold anywhere. A single dishonest answer would immunize a machine for free. He decided he could not allow that. And the way he chose to prevent it is the heart of this story, the safeguard that backfired. To stop defenders from faking a yes, Morris added a rule. Every 7th time the worm was told yes, this machine already has a copy, it would ignore the answer and install itself anyway. His reasoning was that a defender's fake yes could only block the worm 6 times out of 7. 1 time in 7, the worm would get in regardless, and so no machine could be permanently sealed simply by lying. On paper, it is a neat answer to the problem he had set himself. It defeats the cheat. It keeps the worm alive in a hostile world. The trouble is that the rule cannot tell a lie from the truth. It only counts. Now follow what that rule actually does among honest machines, the ones that were telling the truth. On a real, already infected computer, the answer yes was correct. There genuinely was a copy present. And yet, 1 time in 7, the worm disregarded the truth and added another copy. The safeguard, meant to keep at most 1 worm per machine, now guaranteed that copies would sometimes stack up on machines that were already infected. There is a second detail that made it worse, and the technical analyses drew it out. A worm that skipped the check in this way did not just add 1 extra copy. It never took part in the shutdown negotiation at all. In the words of the analysis, it became immortal. It could never be the copy that agreed to die. So the extra copies were not only more numerous, They were unkillable by the worm's own mechanism. Only shutting the machine down could clear them. And there was a matter of timing. The check for an existing copy did not happen the instant the worm arrived. It happened later, after the new arrival had already gone to work trying to reach other machines. So even a worm that would eventually agree to die first spent effort spreading. A flaw of replication was built in before the safeguard ever ran. Put those together, and the outcome was not a stable population of one worm per machine. It was growth. The appeals court stated the failure in a single sentence that is worth hearing exactly. Morris, it wrote, underestimated the number of times a computer would be asked the question, and his 1 out of 7 ratio resulted in far more copying than he had anticipated. The Cornell Commission reached the same conclusion by a different road. They reasoned about it the way a biologist reasons about a population. For the worm to hold steady at a low number on each machine, its birth rate and its death rate would have to be balanced almost perfectly across a network of enormous and unknown complexity that Morris had never simulated and could not have simulated. The most probable consequence, they wrote, was uncontrolled growth to the point of saturation, which is exactly what occurred, and they made a pointed observation about that. Any programmer skilled enough to build a worm this intricate should have been able to see that massive replication was, in their words, a foregone conclusion. It required little analysis. That is what lifts this above a simple coding mistake. The failure was not a typo. It was a design decision made carefully to solve a real problem that carried its own catastrophe inside it. The Commission found no evidence that Morris meant for this to happen, but it also found that he displayed, in their phrase, naive conceit in assuming he could launch an untested, complex program onto a complex network and have it work correctly the first time. Even undergraduate students, they noted, are taught in introductory courses that untested programs contain errors, that such errors are often subtle, and that one should never assume a program works as intended without the most careful testing. The night the network choked, the worm was released on the evening of the 2nd of November. Morris launched it, not from Cornell, but from a computer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The court record is direct about why. That institution was selected to disguise the fact that the worm came from Morris at Cornell. It spread faster than he expected. The Cornell Commission found that the first machine reached was a computer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at around 8 in the evening, and that within hours the worm was moving across the country. On the West Coast, undergraduates at Berkeley returning from dinner noticed something strange. A machine logging repeated, rapid attempts to get in. Administrators began to realize their computers were slowing under a load they could not explain. Then something happened that tells you what kind of community this was. Teams at Berkeley, at Purdue, and at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology began taking the worm apart in the small hours and sharing what they found. Because the worm was a compiled program, a block of machine instructions rather than readable text, they had to reverse it, working backward from the raw code to figure out what each piece did. Groups that had never coordinated before did the work in parallel and compared notes through the night. One researcher started a mailing list to hold the effort together. By around 2:30 in the morning, on the 3rd, the first preventive suggestions were circulating. The first repair for the mail method went out a few hours later, around 6. The fix for the finger method took longer, into the evening. By the end of that day, most sites were on the mend. Morris himself, realizing what he had done, tried to help. Through a friend at Harvard, he arranged for an anonymous message to be sent out, an apology and instructions for how to stop the worm. But the network was now so congested by the worm's own traffic that the message was delayed roughly a full day. By the time it arrived, other people had already worked out the fix. The damage, it is important to say clearly, was congestion, not destruction. The General Accounting Office was unambiguous. The virus caused no lasting damage. It did not destroy or alter files. It did not intercept private mail. It did not reveal data or passwords. Its impact was lost processing time on the infected computers and lost staff time putting them back online. Hundreds of people at institutions across the country working late to clean up. How many machines? Here, the record asks for honesty. The figure that reached the press was about 6,000, and it came from extrapolating a single institution's guess to the whole network. The General Accounting Office cited a Harvard researcher's more careful estimate of somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 computers infected. Cornell's own facilities manager estimated only about 100 to 150 machines on the Cornell campus. The exact number was never established. No single organization was even responsible for counting. What changed? Wild Hunt into Re. 3 things came out of that week that outlasted it. The first was institutional. Before the worm, there was no one to call. The General Accounting Office found that the lack of a central point for responding to network-wide security problems had made everything harder. Communicating warnings, coordinating the response, distributing the fixes. In the middle of November 1988, within days of the incident, DARPA established the first computer emergency response team at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. That model, a standing team ready to coordinate when the next incident came, spread from there. The General Accounting Office went further and recommended a government-wide security focal point for the network, though that particular recommendation was later shelved. The second was legal. Morris was tried and convicted by a jury of violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, a federal law that was only 2 years old. He was the first person convicted under its felony provision. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, a fine of $10,050, and the costs of his supervision. In 1991, a federal appeals court affirmed the conviction, and in doing so, it worked through basic questions that had never been tested, including what it means to access a computer without authorization. The case became a foundation stone of American computer crime law. There is a quieter part of the aftermath that sits underneath the legal story, and the Cornell Commission spent real time on it. It concerns the flaws themselves and why nobody had closed them. At least one of the holes the worm used had been known for years at Harvard, where it had been found and quietly patched on local machines. It had never been reported to Berkeley, who maintained the software for everyone. And the reason was not laziness. It was a genuine dilemma that the whole community felt. If you posted a security flaw publicly, you warned the defenders, but you also handed a weapon to anyone who wanted to use it. One expert quoted in the record put it as the problem of getting word to the people in white hats without letting the black hats hear. In that atmosphere of uncertainty, with no agreed rule about who to tell, flaws sat unreported for years. The worm did not create that problem. It exposed it. The third change was harder to legislate. It was in how the profession understood its own responsibility. The Cornell Commission refused to treat the worm as a clever experiment that got out of hand, and it refused to treat its author as a folk hero. It reached for an analogy to make the point. This was not, they wrote, like wandering through someone's unlocked house doing no harm. A closer comparison would be taking a golf cart and driving it around someone's house uninvited on a rainy day. The driver might navigate carefully and break no china, but he should have known the mud on the tires would leave tracks through the house that someone else would have to clean up. The commission found, in careful language, that Morris probably did not intend to cause damage and probably did not intend the runaway replication that occurred. But it also found that, given his knowledge, he knew, or clearly should have known, that such a consequence was certain, given the design of the worm. That, the Commission wrote, was reckless disregard. The lesson it drew was not about Unix. It was about the duty of anyone with the power to affect thousands of people at once, to stop and consider the consequences before acting. Robert Morris went on to finish his doctorate and to become a professor of computer science. The network he disrupted grew into the one we all depend on, and the safeguard he built, the one meant to keep his creation in check, remains one of the cleanest lessons in the whole record. A well-intentioned mechanism added to defeat an imagined enemy that in ordinary operation did precisely the thing it was designed to prevent. Understand the small decision, and you understand the failure. This has been Findings of Fact. Thanks for watching. Every source is linked in the description if you want to dig deeper. If we got anything wrong, let us know in the comments. We'll pin the correction. And subscribe so the next investigation finds you. Or keep watching. The next one's on screen now.